In this video I'm going to show you how to solve a polynomial equation, and before we begin, let's review the method of solving polynomial equations. So if you have a polynomial equation, it always can be written in a way that you have a polynomial on one side and 0 on the other. And if you have a polynomial on the left hand side of the equation, then that polynomial can be written either in standard form or factored form. And if it's written in factored form, then it looks something like this: x minus something, maybe to some power, x minus something else, maybe to some other power. You might have a bunch of these terms, and all that is equal to 0. And if it's written in standard form, then it looks something like this. You have leading term with the leading coefficient, and then you have all other terms written in the way that their powers are decreasing, and the last will be the free coefficient. So these are the two different ways to write the polynomial. Now, the way we solve polynomial equations, we really don't have an option but to write it in factored form first and then apply the zero product property. So what does the zero product property suggests? So zero product property of multiplication says if you have a product of multiple factors equal to 0, that means one of them has to be equal to 0, at least one. So how do we use the zero product property when solving polynomial equations? We first write it in factored form, and factored form means we have a product of multiple factors. So by zero product property, we conclude that one of these factors has to be equal to 0. So we write it like this. But when you look at each of these factors and set them equal to 0, that becomes a much simpler equation than a polynomial. So we can always just solve it by isolating the variable. So what's the plan when solving polynomial equations? Step 1, write it in factored form. Step 2, use the zero product property. After you use the zero product property, it should be pretty clear how to solve the resulting equations. They should be linear or quadratic. So let's take a look at our problem. Here we have a cubic polynomial. So let's add 5 to both sides to write it in standard form. Now the next step is we have to factor it. So factoring isn't always easy. Sometimes it's impossible. So it just really takes practice to become good at factoring. This particular polynomial can be factored by grouping. So I can group the first and second term together and third and fourth and factor what they have in common. So what do the first two terms have in common? Y squared. What do the second pair of terms have in common? They don't have much in common, but I can factor out negative to match this y minus 5 factor. Now we look at these two terms. What do they have in common? Well, they both have y minus 5, so we can factor that out. So after you factor out y minus 5, what's left is y squared minus 1. Where does 1 come from? 1 is this coefficient of this y minus 5. So we continue factoring. y squared minus 1 can be factored using the difference of squares formula into y minus 1 times y plus 1. And we just add y minus 5 to it and set it back to 0. So this part could take a long time. So this is factoring. This was an easy example. In general, it's not so easy. But once you factor your polynomial and write it in factored form, solving equation then becomes super easy. All you have to do is just, we say, apply the zero product property, but what it actually means is we just say that either y minus 1 equals to 0, or y plus 1 is equal to 0, or 1 minus 5 is equal to 0. Solving each of these linear equations individually, we get that y equals 1, or y equals negative 1, or y equals 5. With enough practice, you may skip this step and learn how to write your answer right from the factored form. So let's write the answer in the form of the set. So our solution set to this polynomial equation is 1, negative 1, 5.